What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Plant the Spear Podcast. I'm your host, Jesse, and thanks for tuning in. Hope everyone's doing good out there. I do apologize for not getting an episode out last week. I just kind of had some personal things I had to take care of. We got the website moved over to the new servers. That should be a lot faster, so hopefully you guys have a better experience when you go to our website. And I have put out some position preview articles out there if you guys want to check that out. I just posted the running backs preview today. And then, of course, it is that season, so I had to do taxes the other day. And anytime you put business taxes in there, things get a little complicated, and investments and things like that. So, and I do my own taxes, which probably isn't smart, but TurboTax kind of helps you out with that. So, while I try to never go more than a week without an episode, if it starts to get like a month without an episode, then I don't know, maybe the IRS came and got me or something. But hopefully they don't listen to the show anyway. I'm just messing around, guys, but everything's good here. So with that being said, this episode will touch on some of the other sports, with baseball opening up and softball having a big tournament. Not too in-depth there. But the main thing I want to talk about in this episode is Florida State football 2022 versus Florida State football 2023. And the reason I bring it up is there was some talk the other day on social media, and I believe it actually originated from someone who covers Florida, or he's a Florida fan. I think he covers Florida, which, go figure, it would come from a Florida fan. But then it caught on. I saw more posts about it, about people talking about 2023 Florida State, and are they overhyped? Some of the Florida tweet said something about he didn't think they would be that good. They would take a step back. And to me, that's just kind of a ridiculous statement, especially coming from someone who, and I don't blame him if he covers Florida, for not knowing Florida State inside and out. But when you really look at the grand scheme of things, when you look at the big picture, it's obvious to see why Florida State should take another step forward in 2023. But that statement comes from one who doesn't know this team inside and out. So it's kind of a statement where you're just pulling things out of thin air. And to me, that's what I kind of want to address today, to kind of give an inside look at why I think it's going to be a little bit better, well, should be a lot better in 2023. Now, is Florida State overhyped for 2023? I don't know yet, because, I will say there's a lot of hype around this team. And it does concern me, because we did see last year where they lost to three of the better teams on their schedule. When the Wake Forest game came about, that was their first game being ranked, and they went on a 3-game skid after that. So I am concerned with how they handle expectations, but I think you're going to learn a lot about that coming out game 1 against LSU. And I think that they're more well equipped. These guys knew when they came back for 2023. They knew they were still going to have to go through tour duty. They knew it was still going to be a challenge. They know the expectations that are on their shoulders. So I don't think that it's really going to be a big issue for them, because when you look at the overall grand scheme of 2022, they won 10 games. They won 9 regular season games. They beat LSU. And not only did they handle the weaker teams on the schedule, they blew a lot of them out. So it's not like you lost to the good teams and then barely beat the bad teams. You barely lost to the good teams on your schedule, and you beat the brakes off the bad teams. So they handled their business. And when they played the lesser competition, now they just have to take that step to beat some of the better teams on their schedule, which is one of my goals for 2023. But at the same time, like I said, they took a big step. This team had a breakout season last year, but they really didn't win anything. You didn't win the Atlantic, you didn't win the ACC, and you didn't make a New Year's Six Bowl. So I think this team is still hungry. They know what's at stake. They know the talent that they have. They know that they're returning the most production in college football, so they know there's expectations. And as we've talked about before, when you come to a place like Florida State, there are expectations. Not do I think they should be ranked in the top 5 above Alabama and teams like that? Maybe not. I think maybe somewhere in the top 10, top 15, and let us earn it a little bit. If they can get to October 4-0 or 3-1 with a win against Clemson on the road, or LSU, or both, then yeah, they're going to be in the top 5. They're going to be a top 4 team already with those 2 wins under their belt. And I'm okay with letting them earn a little bit, let them have a little bit of chip on their shoulder. So maybe top 4, top 5 might be a little overhyped to start with. But to me, I'm not going to say that this team is going to go 12-0, but I don't see why anything less than 10-2 in the regular season is a disappointment. To me, 10-2, 11-1 is very likely, with 12-0 being a very real possibility. And a lot of that stems from when you look at what 2023 is versus 2022, which we're going to get into, and when you look at a lot of the competition. Because when I looked at the schedule last year, when I did my win-loss prediction, and if you listen to the Grading Myself episode, and this is like a humble brag, but I got pretty much everything right, and as far as the schedule, down to every win-loss prediction. And the way I went about that was I knew what Florida State had in hand, and then I went and looked at the competition, because to me that's the most important. Who's bringing back what? Who has what? And if you listen to the midseason review I did when I talked about Wake Forest, NC State, and Clemson in particular, I broke down by snap count how much experience each team had at their respective program. And the numbers were astoundingly higher for those three programs than what Florida State had. Florida State was still a very young team in 2022 as far as players having time in that program under that system. Whereas you had teams like Wake Forest, NC State, and Clemson that had a lot of those super seniors, a lot of veteran guys who had been in those programs at the same system for a long time. And that really does make a difference. I mean, continuity and experience in the systems where you're not learning on the fly is huge. Now, Florida State did get the benefit of a lot of their players. I think almost all of them were early enrollees last year, so you had some time to get on the same page, and we saw that pay off. So now imagine with a whole nother season under their belt, a whole nother offseason under their belt, working together in the same systems. You did not have a coordinator change like some programs had. You did not have a head coach change like some programs may have had, or you didn't lose your quarterback like a lot of teams did. And for the first time in a long time, Florida State finally gets to benefit from being the team returning the most production, with the most continuity, with no coordinator changes and things like that. So it's going to pay big dividends into 2023. But first up, let's talk about 2022. Now, we know Florida State had a breakout season there, but here's the thing to keep in mind. So first off, Florida State lost their starting offensive tackle when you kind of work your way from the trenches back. So looking at the offensive line, you had Bless Harris go down before game one. So you already started the season down your starting offensive tackle. Now, granted, you had Justin Turnentine be able to step in, and he did a formidable job there, but I truly feel like he was brought in to be a depth piece. I mean, he had really good size and SEC experience, but it was very hit or miss with a lot of his like PFF grades and game experience and things like that. So, he was forced into a starting role. And then you also had Darius Washington, who had to play multiple positions throughout the year. You had a walk-on center playing in the LSU game, I believe, at one point. So, you kind of had to make some changes on the fly there. And that's the thing that has changed a lot this year that we'll talk about when we get into 2023. But then you also, working your way back, you look at quarterback. So we know Jordan Travis had experience in 2021, but he had never had a full year as QB1 to really take control of this offense, stay in rhythm, because, a lot of times they would rotate in Mackenzie Milton, or he had to miss a little bit of time with injury. So now he has a full year as QB1 with confidence running this offense against good competition, knowing he's not going to get the hook at some point. So I think that's going to pay huge dividends as well. And you also talk about running backs. Now, Trayshawn Ward had been here for a while, but he had never really had to take that leadership role. You also had Trey Benson, who was coming off a devastating injury at Oregon, which meant 2022 was actually his first full collegiate season. Then you look at Lawrence Toafili. He's still a young guy who has not got a lot of experience at the position. So now, those two guys, of course, we know Trayshawn Ward transferred out, but you also now you have Trey Benson and Lawrence Toafili with a full year under their belt in this offense. You bring in a guy like Keziah Holmes, who now has more experience as well. That's a guy with 2 years in the Big Ten. So you're bringing in all this experience. You have Rodney Hill, who got to play some last year. You also have C.J. Campbell, who's coming back, who, even though he had an injury, he still got another year to learn this offense and a few snaps there. When you look at wide receiver, this was Johnny Wilson, Micah Pittman. This was both their first year in this Florida State offense. They coming from another program. So it takes time to get acclimated. It takes time to get on the same page and get that timing down with your quarterback. You have Pokey Wilson, who's been here for a while, and he had a good year. He stepped up last year, and he was a really big play receiver for you. But you also look at guys like Portier and Malik McLean, who we know he's transferred out, but these were also relatively young and inexperienced guys. And so now you're bringing back a lot of that. Even when you look at a guy like Winston Wright, who he didn't get to play last year, but he also was around the program, around practice for an entire year. So now when he does step foot on the field, he's going to know this offense. He's going to know the playbook, and he should be ready to go and able to practice, well in the spring, so he can get those valuable reps to get on the same page with Jordan. Also talking about quarterback, you now have Tate Rodemaker, who's a multi-year experienced backup. He's got to play in some of these games when Florida State was able to get some blowout wins. He was able to get experience there. He's got you a road win at Louisville, so he's got a little bit of confidence under his belt too. Talking about tight ends. Now, Cam McDonald was a very veteran player that you have to replace, but and this is no dish against Cam, but really he was your only tight end that was a veteran experienced guy. We saw Marqueston Douglas be able to step up last year, which should pay dividends into 2023, but we feel that you've upgraded that position. So across the board, when you look at the offense, you just had a lot of new faces that had to learn to play together kind of on the fly. And you also look at the defense. It was not the same story, but kind of the same story, because you had Jared Verse. This was his first year ever playing Power 5 football in this defense. You had Tatum Bethune. It was the same story. You saw Azarie Thomas get a lot of playing time last year as a true freshman. And then when you had Fabian Lovett go down at defensive tackle, you saw a lot of young guys who were inexperienced get playing time. And so while you have to replace some veterans on defense as well, and Jamie Robinson and Robert Cooper, who are going to be, a little difficult to replace, I feel like Florida State is a lot more experienced now in the same system, and that really does make a huge difference. So just looking at 2022 overall, like I said, you had a team that had a breakout year. You had a team that had a lot of potential coming into the season. And if you remember in my preseason preview, one of the keys to success in 2022 was potential equals production. We had to see guys like a Micah Pittman, like a Trey Benson, like a Jared Verse and Tatum Bethune, who we knew had a lot of potential, but hadn't really produced a whole lot. Well, not Tatum Bethune because he was a 100-plus tackler, but these guys who didn't have a whole lot of stats that jumped off the page at you, at least at the Power 5 level, that you knew you could rely on. And now you do. Now you have proven college production, which is something I really like to rely on versus just this guy should be a good player, because a lot of times we see very talented players that really don't produce much. But now you have a lot of production to count on, to rely on going into this season. And you also have a lot better depth. So now that we've talked about 2022, let's look at 2023 and why this team, in my opinion, should take another giant step forward. Now, when you say giant step, there's only so much room to get better. I mean, they went 10-3, so there's only so much room to get better. But I do think they should be a better team. I do think they should continue to, kind of blow out some of the weaker teams in the conference. And I think now they should be able to beat the better teams on their schedule, or at least be neck and neck with like a Clemson and the LSUs of the schedule, and really make a run at the ACC championship and the playoffs. So again, starting up front with the offensive line. Now, of course, you have to replace Dylan Gibbons, but you've brought in multiple Power 5 transfers who have multiple starts at the Power 5 level, to the point where you could have guys as depth pieces who were Power 5 starters. And that's going to be huge, because even then you look at like a guy like Jeremiah Byers, who was not a Power 5 player, but he also was a very good lower level player. He was a decorated player from that level. So now, like, say, for instance, if you have a guy go down, you're not bringing in someone who hasn't played a lot, doesn't have a lot of experience. You're not really sure how they're going to do. Your starting offensive tackle was from Lamar at one point until he went down with injury. Now you got a guy who's a decorated player who can step in there even at the lower level. You have Bless Harris, who's now been around the program for another year, who can step in. If you have to shuffle some guys around or whatever, you have an SEC player in Keandre Jones, who's an experienced SEC starter who can play for you. You have Casey Roddick from Colorado, who's an experienced Power 5 player. So you now have more components to work with. Of course, you're going to miss Dylan Gibbons, who was he was a stud at offensive line. He really came in and made a big difference. Really, if you want to sum up Dylan Gibbons, his on-the-field play, because we know what he did off the field. There was that one picture that came out where his face mask was bent to the side because he was just moving dudes. And so, he's going to be hard to replace, but you've also got a lot more experience. You got Robert Scott, who brings back a lot of veteran experience. You have Dimitri Emmanuel, who now has a year at FSU, whereas last year was his first season. And, you also have Maurice Smith, who's a very experienced player for you now, and all the other guys that we talked about. You also have guys like Thomas Schrader and a few of the others that are behind them that are going to be able to bring in that experience, and that's going to pay dividends. Like I said, when you look at all the guys, you have Julian Armella, who was a guy, you really didn't see in a starting role in big games last year, but now he's got that high upside and a year of strength and conditioning development. So you got to feel good about what this offensive line is going to do in 2023. And they were good in 2022. They weren't perfect, but they were a lot better. So you feel better about what they're going to be able to do in 2023. Now, when you look at quarterback, of course, like we talked about, you have Jordan Travis, who comes back as one of the top 5 quarterbacks, top 10 quarterbacks in all of college football when you look at his entire body of work. no, he's probably not going to throw for, like 4,500 yards or something like that, like maybe Caleb Williams. But this is a run-heavy offense. So when you look at how he manages the offense, having more experience in the system, he really didn't even use his legs a lot last year. I think he really didn't have that many rushing yards at all compared to what he did before. So he's now learned to use his arm first and legs when needed, but he still has that ability. He's already being talked about Heisman hype and things like that. Now, of course, again, this all depends on Florida State staying healthy and how they handle these expectations, which, does worry you a little bit. But again, you have that experienced starter at quarterback now. So anytime you return, the most important position in college football and football in general, that's a huge boost for you, because one thing we're going to talk about later is the competition, which factors into this a lot. And there's a lot of teams that have made a change at quarterback. Now, when you look at the running backs, of course, you have Trey Benson coming back for another season, and he put up 994 yards in his very first season at Florida State, his real first collegiate season. So you would think that just being the makeup of the running back room, he is now going to be your clear running back number one. Whereas maybe at first you thought it was Trayshawn Ward, and then we kind of saw how things played out in the season. To me, now he's your clear RB1. And I think he's going to break the 1,000-yard mark, like he said his goal was to be the first 1,000-yard rusher since Cam Akers. Now, granted, there could be a little bit, I have to say this too, when you look at the schedule, there's a lot of teams that Florida State should probably blow out. And so he may get some load management late in games, which is something that I actually mentioned in the running back preview I just published, where I think that's a good thing, because now you can keep them healthy, you can keep them fresh, you can do that load management. Because again, this team has the expectations of an ACC championship, of possibly making the playoffs and winning a national championship. So it's important to keep these guys healthy for the course of the season. So now you can turn to guys like Rodney Hill, CJ Campbell, Keziah Holmes, and let those guys carry the load, because to be honest, Florida State probably should be able to beat some teams like Southern Miss, Northern Alabama, Virginia Tech, teams like that. You should be able to, Miami even, you should be able to beat a lot of those teams with kind of some of your second string guys at certain positions. Not all positions, but certain ones. So like I said, when you look at the running back position, now coming back this year, you're bringing back 298 carries of experience, 1,683 rushing yards, and 17 touchdowns. And like I said, to me, Trey Benson, he was top 10 in missed tackles forced. He was 6th overall, actually, in all of college football in missed tackles forced, with 79 on the season. But when you look at the guys that finished above him, the 5 players, they averaged 123 more carries than Benson. So had he had a equal workload, you would figure that he probably would have led the country probably by a wide margin. He averaged 6.5 yards per carry, which was top 10 in backs with at least 150 carries. So you feel really good about what you're bringing back, even with the loss of Trayshawn Ward, because you have talented backups like Toafili, like Keziah Holmes, like Rodney Hill, who was a young guy that flashed last year, but now has another year in strength and development at a college level and also has some college experience. Now, we're still going to have to see some of these other guys prove it, because guys like Rodney Hill and CJ Campbell, a lot of their carries came in garbage time against some not-so-great teams. So we'll have to see it against a better competition. But overall, I would say so far, you feel better about the offensive line and the depth, most importantly. You feel better about the running back position. When you look at the wide receiver position, you're also bringing back a lot of that experience. A guy like Johnny Wilson and Micah Pittman, they didn't have experience in this offense in 2022 like we talked about. Johnny Wilson had 897 receiving yards last year, which was a huge step for him. His last year at Arizona State, he only had 148 yards of receiving. So when you look at it, he had 202 yards in the bowl game. He had more yards in just the bowl game than he did his entire 2021 season at Arizona State. So this is a guy that has had continued development, and now you give him another year in this offense, another year of development, the confidence, because he even mentioned when he went in the portal, he wasn't sure anyone was going to take him. So now he has that confidence, and he has the continuity with Jordan Travis being on the same page. So that's going to help you there. Micah Pittman was another guy that really didn't have a whole lot of experience at Oregon, because that's one of the reasons he transferred, because he wasn't being used a whole lot there. And now he has a whole nother year here. His 32 receptions were second highest of the receiver group. So he is now more experienced. He's on the same page. You look at Kentron Portier. Darian Williamson, Ja'Kai Douglas, those were all young, inexperienced guys who now have that extra year. So you're bringing back a lot of experience. When you talk about a guy like Deuce Spann, he really had never even played the position. He transferred from being, he was originally a quarterback who now has another year of development at wide receiver. Winston Wright, we know he missed all of last year, but again, like we said, he's been around the program. He's been watching, practice when he couldn't practice. He's been studying his playbook. So when he steps in, he should be ready to go. And that was really one of the most dynamic weapons at wide receiver that was on this roster that you never even got to see last year. So to me, he was my X factor in 2022, and unfortunately, we never saw him touch the field. So, he's going to have a really kind of a retribution mindset this year, going through what he went through coming back from injury, and I think he's going to have a really big year. I think he's one of the most underrated players that people forget about here. Now you add a guy like Hakeem Williams, too, a 5-star freshman who you're going to see get a lot of time on the field, and this is a guy that's going to command playing time because he has a really unique and skill set, and he's very talented. So you have built more depth and have more experience at the wide receiver position as well. So it's just another position group that you feel better about going into 2023. And continuing down the line, when you look at tight end, you're now bringing back 72 receptions, 898 receiving yards, and 11 touchdowns. Now, of course, not all that was at Florida State when you consider Jaheim Bell and Kyle Morlock. But you do bring back Marqueston Douglas, who had a kind of a big season for him, who's an emerging young player. And I think he's not going to take the transfer sitting down lightly. He's going to work to get on the field and get his touches. So when you look at that, and then you look at Jaheim Bell, who's a guy that can be used in multiple ways, multiple positions, not just tight end, but he's a really productive guy who has a skill set that you haven't had. Because like we talked about, you had Cam McDonald, and that was really about it. Now you have a guy where if you can get him the ball in space, which we know Norvell is good at doing to his tight ends, he can now make people pay for that. If you give him the ball in space, he can turn that 10-yard pass into a 30-yard touchdown. You bring in a guy who's like Kyle Morlock, who's 6'7", another red zone threat. Now, of course, you got to see how he's going to transfer over from being at a Division II level, but he was a 2-time Division II All-American. So you have a decorated player coming from the lower level. You're upping that talent floor. So you do feel better about that. And that's still not counting someone like Jarrell Powers, Brian Courtney, Preston Daniel comes back, who are guys who are more experienced that you really didn't see anything from last year. So really across the board on offense, at every single position, you feel better about every position being more experienced with better depth. Now, of course, a lot of this, like we said, is going to depend on them staying healthy if you want to make the type of run that you do. But, you feel better about every position across the board. Now, when you flip over to defense, you also, when you look at your defensive line, you had a lot of young guys that had to get playing time. Patrick Payton was not a household name last year, and now he looks like an up-and-coming stud defensive lineman. You had a guy like Joshua Farmer who played well over 100 snaps more than Fabian Lovett, who only had 39 snaps the previous year of experience. So you have been able to build that depth and get that experience in 2022, and you've also upgraded position. Now, of course, like we said, you lost Robert Cooper, who was a very veteran player for you. And I love Robert Cooper, but maybe he wasn't the most high-end guy, whereas now you bring a guy like Braden Fisk in, you bring in a Darrell Jackson, who's probably an upgrade from Jarrett Jackson, you bring back Fabian Lovett, who can hopefully stay healthy this year. And we saw any time Fabian Lovett was not on the field, which was a majority of the season, Florida State struggled in the interior. They struggled to stop the run. So now if you have a guy with Power 5 starting experience, you have Fabian Lovett coming back, you have Joshua Farmer, who has this experience now. You have a guy like Braden Fisk, who is a really talented player coming from Western Michigan. Now, like we said, you always got to kind of question how these guys are going to transition into Power 5 football, but you feel really good about what you got there. You also have Malcolm Ray, who's another guy who has significant experience now that is a quality depth rotation player for you. And, that's just to name a few. So you do feel really good about what the defensive line is going to bring on your interior compared to last year, where anytime Fabian Lovett was off the field, that honestly probably cost you. When you look at the Clemson game, they gashed you up the middle with, with Shipley. When you look at Wake Forest, you couldn't really do anything to blow up that mesh point, that slow mesh point offense that they run, because you didn't have your best defensive tackle, who is your best penetrator. Now you should have him back, and if he can stay healthy and have him for the whole season, when you consider all the guys that we just talked about, you should have better depth, and you should be able to do some more load management with the guys that you have with better depth and higher end talent. When you look at defensive end, you're also bringing back guys like Derek McClendon, Dennis Briggs, who are quality, experienced players in the system. You add a Gilbert Edmond, who is an SEC experienced player. Of course, we already talked about Patrick Payton, who had a breakout freshman season and will now have another year of experience in the weight room. And of course, you can't talk about defensive end without the fact that you brought back a potential first-round NFL draft pick in Jared Verse, who it was just his first year in Power 5 football last year and his first year in this defense. So another year in Florida State strength and conditioning program, another year in this defense with experience now. I mean, you got to feel a lot better about what you have up front. Now, when you look at the linebackers, you also bring back a lot of your experienced players. Tatum Bethune, Kalen DeLoach, DJ Lundy, Brendan Gant, who now have a lot more experience in this defense and on the field and in the college strength and conditioning program. So, of course, you're going to expect them to be as good or take another step forward. And I think, obviously, that's going to pay dividends for this defense. Looking at the secondary, I think the first thing you need to mention is that they're probably going to have better coaching. And that's no dig at Marcus Woodson, but I just feel like when you have a guy who played high-level DB in college and at the NFL and has coached, at least been on a defensive staff in the NFL, and some of the things he said in his introductory press conference, I think you're going to see better play from your secondary. Of course, it's going to be hard to replace Jamie Robinson, but you also have some experience back there as well. You could see someone like Travis J step in. You also have Shaheem Brown, who is a player that I'm high on. And you still have Akeem Dent, who now has a lot of experience at safety and is a good player for you. When you look at cornerback, you bring in Fentrell Cypress, who was the top-rated cornerback in the portal. You also have Azaria Thomas, like we mentioned. Now, he's a really good player, and you saw when he was on the field last year, he flashed. You were like, man, that guy just moves different than a lot of the other players. But you also saw him make a lot of freshman mistakes. I think one or two of the touchdowns in the Clemson game were miscommunications that he was on that side of the field. So now you clean up some of that freshman mistakes. You have that experience. He's going to be a breakout player for you. Plus, a lot of the guys like Amarion Cooper and Kevin Knowles that kind of regressed last year, maybe the coaching is going to be able to unlock their potential again because we saw them flash in 2021. We saw what they could do. So to me, overall, you feel good about the secondary as well. And, anytime you have a better defensive line up front, obviously that naturally helps your secondary. And there was a lot of times when you didn't have Fabian Lovett on the field, you just really couldn't get pressure. And, heaven forbid you give Patrick Payton or Jared Verse a rest at the same time, you really could get no pressure on anybody. So these are the things that are all going to play well together. You look at individual groups and how they've upgraded multiple positions, and this goes for offense too, and how you've brought back that experience, how you've added that depth, how you have more experience in the system playing together so you don't make those mistakes. And all that, when you combine all those individual position groups that you feel better about and you gel that into each side of the ball, that makes you feel better about the unit as a whole. The defense, of course, the secondary should be better because of the defensive line. The defensive line should be better because you upgraded the positions. You have more experienced linebackers behind them. Your running backs now have a legit passing threat to help open up holes for them. You feel better about the quarterback because he has better experienced receivers. I mean, it all snowballs into the expectations and what this team should be able to do. Another area that's huge, when you look at special teams, Florida State, we know, struggled in the kicking game last year. Fitzgerald seemed to find some confidence and some rhythm towards the end of the season once he changed his method back to the three-step approach. So he may have a better year this season. But if not, they also brought in a kicker from East Tennessee State who they at least can go to another option. They can at least try somebody else because we saw how kicking affected a lot of their red zone planning. A lot of times they went for it on fourth down where maybe they shouldn't have. If they could have settled for a field goal, if they had a field goal kicker who was reliable, maybe they win the NC State game. So all that plays into it. You also have Winston Wright, who could be a kickoff returner. I mean, he was really good at West Virginia at kickoff return. Obviously, we know Trey Benson took one to the house last year, but if he's running back number one, you don't want to risk the added injury with him back there. So, again, you could see another step up in special teams as well. So, to me, as a whole, you've pretty much gotten better at every position group except for safety. And, there still could take someone in the portal, but you also have better DB coaching. a better defensive line to help out your secondary, and you still have guys. I mean, Travis Jay is someone who has a really high upside. We've just never seen it translate. And so maybe he takes that step forward this year. So as a whole, like I said, you feel better about your experience, your depth, and your talent level in basically every position group on the field except for one. And there's some things that could help cover for Jamie Robinson being out. And lastly, we'll just touch on the competition, which again, like I said, is one of the biggest aspects when you go through the schedule and you look at win-losses and you start doing predictions. You want to know what everybody else has. Like we talked about, a lot of those teams, the 3 teams you lost to last year, had tenfold more experience than what Florida State did. And, I would have to go back and look it up. But there was like multiple seasons worth of snap counts where they were more experienced than what Florida State brought to the table. So now those tables have turned and Florida State gets to be that team. You had a quarterback change at Wake Forest, and there was a lot of quarterback changes we're going to get to, but Wake Forest is probably the most pronounced one when you look at how long Sam Hartman was there, how much production he accounted for, how much he meant to that offense. And because he played for them so often, and Wake Forest was not a team that blew a lot of people out, they won a lot of close games, the guy behind them, the guys, whoever they're going to turn to, really doesn't have any experience. So that's going to be a huge question mark for them. You also have a quarterback change at NC State with Devin Leary now being at Kentucky. Now they have the Morris kid who's a talented freshman, but again, they lost to Boston College because they had not because they had a freshman quarterback, but they didn't have that veteran experience there. Clemson's making a quarterback change. Now, of course, we know Cade Klubnik has experience in their system, but they also have a new offensive coordinator this year. So he's got to kind of learn a little bit of a new system. And, I mean, if you watch the Orange Bowl, Tennessee's defense is not all that great, especially their pass defense. They're one of them teams that kind of sell out to stop the run. But he looked like a freshman. So you feel like you could do some things against him, especially considering you get him early in the season. And now that you have that defensive line you feel better about, if you can pressure him, that makes you feel good about that game. Pitt also has a new quarterback. Now, of course, it's Jerkovic from BC, but, I'm not the most high on him. Now, he should have some better tools and a better offensive line in front of him, so he could have a really good season. But, it's still a new quarterback and a new system. Pitt, speaking of Jerkovic, BC now has to replace their quarterback. And Florida, they have to replace Anthony Richardson, who maybe wasn't the most talented quarterback, but you're also talking about a guy who kept them in a lot of games with his dual threat ability. So, because Florida lost a lot of players to the portal, and they have a good running game, but a lot of that was helped by Anthony Richardson. So, like I said, when you look at all the teams on Florida State's schedule that had to make a quarterback change, the most important position in college football, and you're bringing back a guy who's a top 10 quarterback in all of college football who now has an extra year of experience under his belt and a backup who has went on the road and won you an ACC game against a good Louisville team and has another year of experience as well, you feel good about Florida State versus the field at that position. And that's not even counting, when you look at a lot of these other teams, like Florida lost over 20 players to the portal. Look at Miami. They're now having to basically retool the entire coaching staff. And, that quote-unquote the best coaching staff in the country fell apart after one season. And now they're having to hire a bunch of group of 5 guys, and they're getting guys turn them down. And, it just kind of looks like the train is really coming off the tracks down in Miami. So you feel good about that game. Now you look at they have to come to you. They have new coordinators. And they lost some players to the portal as well. They lost a lot of their top players like Will Mallory, the tight end, and they lost Darryl Jackson, their starting defensive tackle, who's now on your team. So there's a lot of question marks around a lot of the teams on your schedule that Florida State just doesn't have. Of course, LSU brings back their quarterback in Jaden Daniels, but, I don't think any of us is really sold that he is a great quarterback. Now, he has a running ability that can hurt you, and we saw what their backup did against Georgia where he torched their secondary. But at the same time, now you have film to prepare for against LSU. Whereas last year, you were kind of flying into that game blind. You didn't know what they were going to run. They also don't have Jack Besh anymore. They don't have Keyshawn Boutte anymore. So all that, like I said, all of that, when you consider where Florida State, what they're bringing back and what they should be able to do compared to the question marks that a lot of other teams have, I just don't see where this odd narrative that Florida State is overhyped and is going to regress in 2023 comes from. Now, to be fair, to play devil's advocate a little bit, of course, like I talk about, we love our players, and they have produced at above, say, a 3-star level. You don't have stacked up 5 stars on your roster like a team like Georgia, like a team like Ohio State, Alabama, or even Clemson, who has recruited very well over the last few years. But you've also had some of the best portal classes out there. You have a very talented base, but you don't have a ton of 5 stars. So I could see where maybe, like I said, maybe you don't start them top 4. You let them earn that by beating LSU, by beating Clemson on the road, by getting to October being 3-1 or 4-0. And again, if you get there 4-0 after beating LSU, Southern Miss, which, whatever, but on the road at Boston College and then on the road at Clemson, I mean, you got to feel really good about where this team is going to stand going into the month of October. And that's the thing but there's no reason they shouldn't be a top 10 team the way they finished the season, the way they won their last 6 games in a row, and they carry that momentum into 2023 now. So I do feel like this team, especially led by Norvell, they do carry that mindset of they still have a lot to prove. They know that they fell short of what they wanted to do last year, what their potential was. And, we heard Jordan Travis talk about that. They got the 10 wins that they were aiming for, but they know the standard is higher than that. And I don't think this team is going to be where they just think they can roll the helmet out there because they brought all these players back. They know they have to work for it. They know they still have something to prove. And, if they can get to the month of October 4-0, you should win every other game on your schedule. Now, you have some other challenges in there. But again, I think when you look at, depending on where you look, whether this team's overhyped or not. I've seen some that put them in the preseason top 5, which I think may be a little bit too much. But when you see the ones that end up somewhere around between 5 and 11, I think S&P Plus had them around 11. To me, that's perfectly fair. And again, you're going to have your chance to jump up. You get to October 4-0 with a win over LSU in a neutral site game and Clemson on the road, you're going to be a top 5, top 4 team because those are going to be 2 of the best wins in the month of September that any team on the schedule will have. And so I think the expectations for 2023 should be high because this is a more experienced, better prepared, better depth, better quality depth having team. And so I think it's fair to expect them to win a lot of games and to do good. And I think anything less than 10-2 in the regular season should be a disappointment. I think not making the ACC championship, especially with no divisions this year, will be a disappointment. And so I really look for this team to be able to live up to that hype. I think Florida State is going to have a good year. I do think they're going to go, a minimum of 10-2 in the regular season. I think you're probably going to look somewhere around 11-1. Every team does have an off week, and if they stay healthy, they should be able to beat just about every team. And I know a lot of the talk about this was, you have a team like Florida State who's just going to overtake Clemson all of a sudden after going 5-7 2 years ago and losing by all them points, getting blown out for all them years against Clemson and whatnot. I understand that can be a stretch, and you have to go to Death Valley and do it. But you could also avenge that loss in the ACC championship game. They beat LSU last year, so why couldn't they beat them this year? You beat pretty much, you lost to Wake Forest and NC State, but you don't play NC State this year, and Wake Forest should take a pretty big step back. So you should be able to beat every other team on your schedule. Clemson and LSU are really the ones that you could struggle with. And to me, when you look at Clemson, you've closed the gap on the field. You are not getting blown out anymore. You're competitive in those games. And they have more question marks about what's coming back than you do. So to me, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility for Florida State to catch Clemson and beat them this year. So to me, I think it's kind of fair where Florida State is slated to finish next year. I think they should be a favorite to win the ACC. I think they should be one of the top favorite outside teams to win or at least make the playoffs and be a national championship contender. I think those are fair expectations for this team because they should be better. But you have to look at the whole picture and kind of get into why and not just assume that they're going to take a step back because they didn't beat any ranked teams last year or whatever the excuse was. And so that's really just kind of what I wanted to talk about there was Florida State 2022 versus Florida State 2023 and why I do think this team deserves the expectations that they have and why I think they're going to be a better squad in 2023. And so lastly, the last thing we'll talk about before we get out of here, Florida State Baseball kicked off last week, well not kicked off, but opened up last week with a series over James Madison. They took the series 3-0. They won all 3 games. And I really like what I'm seeing from this team. Now, I'm not a baseball aficionado. I can't really get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on, why they look a whole lot better. I did play baseball in high school, but then I kind of gave it up to play football. But overall, I will say that this team looks a lot better. Their defense looks really good. And it's still early in the season. They still have some things they got to figure out, but their pitching looks good. Their arms look good. And their bats have gotten a little better. I think I saw a stat that said Florida State struck out, I believe it was 15 times over that course of the 3-game series. And last year they struck out 15 times, and I think it was 19 games. So you're already seeing, maybe we were missing the missing link with Link Jarrett, some kind of pun intended there. But I really think Link Jarrett is going to be kind of what unlocks this team's run for success, because not only do they look better on the field in just 3 games, and I know they have another game against Jacksonville, I believe it's today, depending on when you're listening to this, but they look like they enjoy the game again. This team looks like they're having fun. Obviously, when you win, that helps. But, Link is a guy who his attention to detail is like Mike Norvell. You have a guy who not only is he proud to be here, but he pays attention to the little things, the base running, the pitching, the fielding. Everything counts for him. And that's not to say that wasn't the same case with Mike Martin Jr., but we just didn't see him get the most out of this team. And I really feel like that's something that you're going to be able to see Link Jarrett do. So to me, to start your career 3-0 with a sweep of James Madison, and obviously we'll have to see how things go when they get into some tougher competition, but I think it's a really good start for them. And I'm really excited about the season that this baseball team is going to have. And, I think Link was a really great hire. And like I said, of course, we'll have to see how things go once they get into ACC play and things like that. But, just overall looking as just someone watching a couple of I didn't get to watch all of them, but I watched, I think, 2 out of the 3 games. I just feel good about what you see so far. And then softball had a big series with the Clearwater Invitational. Now, unfortunately they lost to UCLA and they lost to Alabama to kind of take them out of the tournament. But they got some ranked wins over, I think it was Arizona and over Louisiana. So, they like to kind of play around with the roster a little bit early in the season just to kind of figure out, get in sync, because you want to do it early. It's like with baseball. You do those experiments early on so that you get hot later towards the postseason so you can make that run. And I mean, if anyone's doubting Lonnie Almeida and the softball team, I don't know who you've been watching the last few years, but I do feel good, obviously, about where they're going. They already got some ranked wins under their belt, and that's good too. Guys, there's not much to say about basketball. It's an absolute dumpster fire. I had said before in another podcast where it was kind of like, okay, I think Leonard has earned another year to try and right the ship, knowing that they had a lot of injuries, knowing they had the Baba Miller suspension and everything like that. It's getting harder to justify that. Now, I've heard there's some conversations going to be had at the end of the season. I don't know, man. Like, I don't know a whole lot about basketball. I really primarily talk about football on here, but I wouldn't necessarily be mad at him getting another year to try and right the ship if they're healthy. But I think the conversation needs to be had. I think some things need to be looked at, whereas if it doesn't bounce back next year, maybe it is time to move on. But I think he has earned the right to at least, self-assess and see if he thinks he can get this thing turned around. And if not, you hope that he would just kind of move on and let Florida State go in a different direction, because this is bad. I mean, it is really bad. But, we constantly joke on social media that with the death of basketball almost, so can be the rebirth of football, because it seemed like basketball came on when football died off. So to me, if this is a necessary sacrifice, I'm okay with it, because I'm excited for what 2023 in football can be. And if it means we have to have a terrible year in basketball, I guess we can live with it. I really hate that Leonard got robbed of the best team that he had the COVID year, when it looked like that was a team that may have been able to win his first national championship at Florida State. But unfortunately, sometimes that's just the way things play out. But overall, guys, that's going to wrap it up for this episode, and I'll try and be back with you guys next week. Like I said, I've just kind of been working a lot lately, picking up some extra shifts at work, just trying to get ready for the fall and hopefully be able to make a few games, because I really am excited about this season. I'm really excited about what Florida State's going to be able to do, and I want to try to make at least a few games, hopefully meet up with some of you guys. I may do a lot of it from home, so I can jump on and record afterwards, so I can give you guys some content. But again, as always, guys, thanks for tuning in. Thank you for all your support, and go Noles.